Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past that honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I am grateful that you're here. Before we start today, a quick show note. I am overwhelmed with the initial response to this podcast. Thank you so much for all of your support and encouragement and the helpful comments that have found their way to me through my email address, which is philipbarlag@gmail.com. Okay, back to the show. Last time, we got to know Thutmose III, widely considered to be the greatest pharaoh in Egypt's absurdly, comically long history. Today, we will meet one of the most famous Egyptian pharaohs, Ramesses II. As with our previous episodes, before we get into our subject, we need to set a little bit of context. Well, maybe a medium amount of context. Or a lot of context? How much context is too much context? Can I please stop saying context? Focus, always an issue for me, will apparently be in great demand as we get to know Ramesses II. This might turn out to be a tricky episode because there are a lot of genuinely fascinating people and events that are prologue to his entrance into the narrative. People that come after Thutmose III, whom we got to know in our last two episodes. Most of this episode will address some big and important, and if I do say so myself, downright interesting people and events. To understand Ramesses II and what he did or did not do to make him great, we need to know more about what he was facing by the time he got the big job. This longish prologue, before we get to today's great, will be worth it because in the gap between Thutmose III and Ramesses II sits arguably the single most famous pharaoh in Egyptian history. So that should count for something, right? I also need to offer an asterisk about names and dates, which I should have done at the start of the last episode. The names by which we now call pharaohs are not the names by which they would have called themselves, or by which their subjects would have called them. For example, our friend Thutmose III went by the regnal name of Menkaperra, which was just one of his royal names. Full pharaonic names usually had multiple parts, referencing different divinities and the pharaoh's dedication to them. His full royal name was, and I'm neither a linguist or an Egyptologist, so I'm going to make some mispronunciations here. Kanak, Kahemwaset, Wanesi Mirempet, Sekhem Pati Jesserkaw, Menkhep Peri, Thutmose, Neferkep Heru. I have to confess, when I got to the Thutmose part of that name, I was a little relieved. So yeah, the names by which we know the pharaohs are definitely oversimplifications. And thank Horus for that. As for dates, well, ages, years, lengths of rules, timelines for successions, they are all imprecise. Historians, dating all the way back to historians keeping track in ancient Egypt itself, all have their own dating conventions. As we reference such dates and times and ages, it might seem exact, but like so much of history, we can never really be sure. One of the timeless and constant tendencies of human behavior is for historians to disagree with each other. Historians have disagreed about everything for as long as people began tracking historical events, right down to the dates. Pretty much everything in this episode, and in several that will follow, is up for debate. Now, someone, somewhere, is yelling, "Get on with it!" So here we go. By the way, that was a pop culture reference. Are you keeping track? When we last talked about Egypt, we did so at the beginning of the transition from the great Thutmose III to his son and successor Amenhotep II. As time progressed, the family enjoyed a long line of uninterrupted succession. Amenhotep II faced similar tests of rebellion and belligerent confrontations that faced his father, and the son did acquit himself well in battle. He claims to have personally slain many enemies with his own hand, and while he didn't expand the empire, he did maintain it. His son, Thutmose IV, likewise more held on to than built the empire. Thutmose IV is most notable for having restored the Great Sphinx of Giza, which was, by his day, already more than a millennium old, and buried up to its head in desert sands. The inscription that sits between the famous statue's paws date from this time. Called the Dream Stele, this inscription tells of a vision that Thutmose IV had, in which the Sphinx promised to make Thutmose pharaoh if he would only remove the sands and restore the statue to its glory. This Thutmose IV did, and he indeed became pharaoh. This gives us just a hint that maybe, just maybe, there were some questions about his legitimacy. After all, If he needed to rely on a promise from a sandstone statue to rule, then maybe that meant that he couldn't count on more orthodox criteria for succession. We'll never know for sure. Thutmose IV was, in turn, succeeded by his son, Amenhotep III. While not the subject of this episode, it's worth noting that this pharaoh is sometimes called Amenhotep the Great, and that he is also considered among the pantheon of great Egyptian pharaohs. Perhaps one-upping his illustrious grandfather, Thutmose III, in addition to being called the Great, Amenhotep III was also called the Magnificent. Even though he's not our main focus for this episode, since this is a series about the greats, let's spend just a second on Amenhotep III. Also, after him, things get a little weird for Egypt, so let's let them enjoy just a brief moment in the sun before getting on with the story. Amenhotep III was the 9th pharaoh from the storied 18th dynasty. He ruled for approximately 37 years, and under his watchful eye, the Egyptian empire reached its zenith in terms of economic development, the arts, and culture. Unlike some of his more warlike ancestors, Amenhotep did little fighting, and there seems to be only one campaign from his reign, when he marched south to put down a rebellion in Nubia. Instead, he focused on diplomacy, deepening ties to foreign powers and shifting the focus from belligerence to partnership, collaboration, trade, and goodwill. Egypt boomed during his rule, and this is reflected in the extensive building that dates to this time. There are more surviving statues, about 250, of Amenhotep III than of any other pharaoh. In addition to his diplomacy, Amenhotep had an unusual relationship with his queen. His great royal wife, Tai, was not born of the nobility, was not related, was not the daughter of some far-off king to cement a political alliance. She was a commoner, unheard of in ancient Egypt. But it was more than her rank, for Amenhotep elevated his wife to a status unique in Egyptian history. She appears by his side in monumental statuary, his equal in size, stature, and regalia, this at a time when kings always overawed their queens. He married for love. He counted his wife as his most trusted partner and promoted her image far and wide. To be sure, he was as vainglorious as any other pharaoh, as evidenced by the proliferation of his statuary, but it's worth noting that his lofty reputation was less about his martial prowess and more about his culture, refinement, diplomacy, and economic prosperity. He was a lover, not a fighter, and that makes him stand out from other widely admired pharaohs. Amenhotep III died sometime around 1353 BCE, one of those temptingly precise dates. That was still a century or two before the Trojans and Greeks would square off in their epic semi-legendary contest. His rule marked not only a high watermark in Egyptian history, but also a turning point, because toward the end of the dynasty, this is when things really got weird and confusing, both to modern people trying to make sense of what happened and those living through the times who had to cope with this substantial change. We've reached a point in this episode where there is a deep, deep rabbit hole right at our feet. We're about to encounter some of the most tumultuous, debated, and well-known people and events in Egyptian history. This period, and the people involved, are the subjects of abiding focus, study, and debate. As you've likely gathered by this point, I do like some context, but we're here to talk about Ramesses II, so we're going to have to gloss over some really big and interesting personalities and events. So what follows is a brief summary, but rest assured, there's lots more to learn here if you're interested. When Amenhotep III died, he was succeeded by his son, Amenhotep IV. For the first few years, it was business as usual. But Amenhotep IV was not like Amenhotep III, and the son had some pretty radical ideas. Egyptian religion was polytheistic. Like many such religions, the Egyptian pantheon had major and lesser gods and goddesses, and their relative importance waxed and waned over the centuries. All religions are a fluid social construct reflective of their times, and this was certainly true in Egypt. So, some measure of religious change is perfectly normal. But in year 5 or so of his reign, Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten and sought nothing less than a complete overhaul of the Egyptian religion. At the time of his accession, the most important deity was Amun. The god was the patron of the key city of Thebes, the capital of the 18th dynasty pharaohs. When this group of kings rose to prominence, so too did their patron god. With the rise of the 18th dynasty, Amun vaulted to the top of the Egyptian pantheon, and so did his priests. God and priests alike, they all became a little insufferable. Amenhotep IV, who from this point forward we will only refer to as Akhenaten, found Amun and Amun's priests too haughty, too powerful, and too much of a threat to pharaonic dignity. He wanted to knock both Amun and his priests down a peg or two. After all, there shouldn't be any earthly group that would question or challenge the supremacy of the pharaoh. Akhenaten, along with his great royal wife, Nefertiti, tore down the structure of Egyptian religion and replaced it with a new system, placing Aten, the god of the sun disk, at the top of the pantheon. We're getting into a really controversial subject here. There is a lot of debate over whether Akhenaten replaced all the Egyptian pantheon with Aten, or placed Aten at the top of an existing and complex pantheon. If the former, which has a broad base of support from scholars, then this marks Akhenaten as the first recorded monotheist in human history. This interpretation makes Akhenaten sympathetic to a lot of modernists, as it aligns an ancient religion with the sensibilities of many monotheists today. It's also quite possible that Aten just got a big promotion, and that was paired with Amun's demotion. In this case, the Egyptian system would have been what we call today a henotheistic system. Either way, though, his reforms were revolutionary, upending the Egyptian cosmos and for many, tilting Egypt out of balance with the sacred principle of Ma'at. To construct his new divine order, Akhenaten also overturned the social hierarchy in the temporal world. Like any good pharaoh, he commissioned monumental building projects, but the scope of what he sought to do was different and on a much higher order. Akhenaten ordered the construction of an entire new city to become a new royal capital at Amarna. This would shift focus away from those arrogant Amun priests at Thebes. This new city was to have temples to Aten, palaces, civic buildings, ritual spaces, etc. It was a huge undertaking, an ambitious plan from an unconventional pharaoh. This shift is why this particular time within the 18th dynasty is now known as the Amarna period. Not content with revolutionizing the religious, political, and social structure of Egypt, Akhenaten next reformed art. His sculptures and inscriptions portray a very different style from long-standing Egyptian pharaonic traditions. Gone are the perfect physiques and the round, smooth features of prior god-king pharaohs. Akhenaten had himself portrayed with outsized features, an elongated face, and almost feminine qualities. Do a quick images search and compare Amenhotep III statues with Akhenaten statues, and you'll see for yourself. The difference is arresting. Akhenaten's sculpture is so different, in fact, that it's given rise to a lot of different theories. Some suggest that Akhenaten was deliberately blending the male and female to highlight that all divinity existed within the pharaoh. Others think that his statues were true to life and indicated physical impairments, possibly as a result of royal inbreeding. Still others contend that he was simply trying to be as different as possible from his predecessors. No matter what, it was a revolution, but it didn't last. Akhenaten died after 17 years on the throne, perfectly average for an 18th dynasty pharaoh, which may undermine the notion that he was suffering from the profound physical ailments ascribed to him by his critics. He may or may not have been succeeded by his queen Nefertiti, again a topic of great debate. Or rule may have passed directly to his 10-year-old son. Either way, that young boy would soon be on the throne. Akhenaten's rule shook the Egyptian world to its core. It left a profound mark, opening a deep divide in Egyptian society between the pharaoh on one side and the priests and people on the other. But for all the seismic shock, we may not have known much about any of this if it weren't for the discovery of the tomb of the most famous, and possibly one of the least consequential, pharaohs. Regardless of whether Akhenaten was succeeded by his queen or directly by his son, his revolutions in religion and government did not long outlive him. With Akhenaten having been distracted by his revolutionary program, Egypt suffered in other ways too. Its position as an expansionist, outward-facing empire began to erode. He had no interest in militarism, and trouble brewed on the borders. Sensing Egypt's waning power, foreign rivals began to seek ways to grab a piece of the territorial pie. Now, if the rule of Amenhotep the Magnificent was the high water mark of Egyptian history, then it was surely that of Akhenaten that witnessed the tide begin to recede. Still, he left a mark. He was a true radical. His system was revolutionary. He took on the priests of Amun. He reconstituted Egyptian civic and religious life, eschewed tradition, and forged a new and entirely unprecedented path. We may even have some of his own words preserved in a prayer called the Hymn to Aten, which supposedly he wrote. We get a little more of his personality, a deeper sense of his agenda, a more complete picture of Akhenaten than we do the people that preceded him. It's for this reason that a prominent Egyptologist called him the first individual in history. That is quite a distinction. Too bad his name would be cursed right after he died. After he was gone, his successors were left to pick up the pieces. His young son, well, probably his son, I'm sure you're tired of hearing it, but this is a subject of debate, ascended to the throne at about age 10. As mentioned, it's possible that Nefertiti, who was both this boy's stepmom and his mother-in-law, ruled in her own right for a brief period. For her part, Nefertiti did not fully adopt the androgynous imagery of her late husband. In fact, the surviving bust of hers, on display in Berlin, depicts a stunning queen. If the sculpture is true to life, then Nefertiti was one of the great beauties of history. Of course, officially commissioned portraits tend to portray their patrons in the best possible light. In a fun little twist, it doesn't appear that this bust was finished within her lifetime, because it was found in the workshop of the sculptor, whose name, fun enough but unrelated to anyone we've met so far, was Thutmose. Anyway, one way or the other, soon enough, Akhenaten's son was on the throne, Pharaoh of Egypt, aged 10. The young king took the name Tutankhaten to reflect the piety that he held to the divine supremacy established by his dad, Akhenaten. It was immediately clear that the reorganization of Egyptian society engineered by Akhenaten was popular with a certain percentage of Egyptian society. 0. 0 is a percent. The people and the powerful priests of Amun were on the brink of revolt. The royal house needed to calm the waters. As such, under the careful guidance of his vizier, which was the chief advisor, the young boy restored the previous religious order, demoting Aten and restoring Amun to the top of the divine pantheon. To reflect his newfound piety and his devotion to tradition, the king changed his name to the one by which he is now known, Tutankhamun. As so many know, Tutankhamun died young, around 18 years old. He was succeeded not by another royal, as his young children seem to have predeceased him, but by his vizier, Ai. Aged by the time of his accession, Ai ruled for about 4 years before dying himself. He, in turn, was not succeeded by a relative or a member of the nobility, but by the head of the army, Horemheb. This commander, with a resolute will, completed the restitution of the Egyptian order to its prior traditions. He did more than decree a new chief god or shift the capital from one site to another. He sought nothing less than the complete eradication of the name and memory of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Tutankhamun, and Ai. In this, he was aided by a large group of people, eager to carry out his orders and vent their pent-up fury over the indignities through which they had to suffer. Akhenaten's capital of Amarna, just so recently built, was razed. Its sculpture, temples, and buildings torn down, turned to rubble. His statues were defaced, his corpse defiled. The nobility, the army, the priests, they all contributed to the vengeance, labeling Akhenaten a criminal and a heretic. The names of the final 18th dynasty pharaohs were excised from inscriptions, carved out of the rock with furious strokes of the hammer and chisel. That dynasty, which began in such glory with the driving out of the Hyksos, the reunification of Upper and Lower Egypt, the peak of Egypt's empire and culture, it limped toward its close in utter ignominy. Those who helped do so did such an effective job damning the memory of Akhenaten and his successors that these figures remained largely unknown for thousands of years. It took the rediscovery of Amarna, the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun, and various other archaeological finds for the memories of these long-lost kings and queens to emerge from the fog of history. There's something ironic in that the most well-known pharaoh in Egyptian history, Tutankhamun, was accursed in his own day and excised from memory. Most Egyptians from that point forward would have had no idea who he was. Even for a pharaoh, he's more well known to us now than he was to people of antiquity. The general-turned avenging pharaoh Horemheb ruled approximately 14 years. He took great pains to restore the traditions of Egyptian society and to reassert the empire's position among the region's powers. Today, Horemheb might bristle where he is slotted in the narrative of Egyptian history. Despite his attempts to create as much distance between himself and his immediate predecessors, historians mark him as the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. In the pages of history, Horemheb sits right next to all those people from whom he tried so hard to distance himself. It was his successor, Ramses I, that would be seen as the one who turned that page and started a new chapter. Now, hopefully, your ears just perked up a little bit. This episode, as we know, is about Ramses II. I just mentioned Ramses I. We've got to be getting close, right? Right. Only one Ramses and one Seti to go. And then I promise, we're there. But we'll move quickly. Well, quickish. Brevity is overrated. The 18th dynasty, on balance, left Egypt better than they found it. But the Amarna period and the disruption that followed had made things a bit shaky. Ramses I was not a member of the royal family. He rose to power much as I had, by serving as vizier to his predecessor. When Horemheb died, Ramses climbed onto the throne and founded a new dynasty. And he only ruled for a year or two, and when he died, his son, Seti I, took over. Seti was a consequential figure for Egyptian history. With the chaos of the preceding decades, Egyptian control in its territories had eroded. In particular, those pesky Canaanite cities that Thutmose III put in their place in our last episode were again a hotbed of agitation. Speaking of Thutmose, in his episode we mentioned that the looming emergence of another expansionist power. It was under this power that the Canaanite and Syrian cities had fallen sway. We can't really get to know Seti I, and definitely not Ramses II, without first getting to know the adversary that defined so much of their reigns. It's time to get a closer look at one of the lost empires of the ancient world, the Hittites. For most of recorded history, the Hittites were the stuff of myth and legend. The Old Testament makes references to Uriah the Hittite, and there are numerous fragmentary pieces of correspondence from Hittite rulers that had been found here and there, but scholars were long at a loss as to who these people were, where they came from. Details were scant, archaeology non-existent. They seemed to be myth, an ephemeral people, enigmatic, lost to the sands of time, a great, semi-mythic, lost civilization. How romantic. And then, as so happens, the picture began to come into focus. There had been pieces of evidence. A stone relief carving here, a strange inscription there. People had been looking at artifacts from the Hittites for some time. They just didn't know what they'd been looking at. The attempts to find the lost civilization were also troubled by the simple fact that most often everyone looked in the wrong place, namely Syria. But in the late 19th century, a series of archaeological discoveries in Anatolia, central Turkey, began to paint an incredible picture. The more scholars dug, the more they found, and the more they found, the more they realized that they had solved the mystery of the Hittites. The Hittites, far from being a historical footnote, were a true power, an aggressive and expansionist kingdom with extensive cities, complex diplomatic relationships with neighboring kingdoms, intricate trade networks, and powerful armies. They may have been the first civilization to smelt iron, a dramatic technical leap forward that ballooned their military capabilities. In short order, the Hittites went from being a rumor, a whisper of history, with plenty of people doubting they even existed, to being understood to be one of the most dominant kingdoms of the Bronze Age for a period of approximately 4 centuries, from 1600 to 1200 BCE. I don't know about you, but the idea of discovering not just a lost city, but a lost empire is really, really inspiring. Lost to the whims of history though they may have eventually become, Seti and the Egyptians would never have made the mistake of overlooking their dangerous contemporaries. During Akhenaten's reign and the subsequent instability, the Hittite king Suppiluliuma forced his way into Egyptian territory, prying some away and adding it to his burgeoning empire. But Akhenaten was too preoccupied with his revolutionary system to do much about it. The Hittite expansion set the stage for future conflict. All Egypt would need was a pharaoh with some backbone. Thus, as the Hittites pushed their borders south, they spread into lands that had previously been held in the sway of the Egyptians. By the time of Seti's ascendancy, he was determined to settle the chaos left by the 18th dynasty and to shore up the foundations of the Egyptian empire. The incursions of the Hittites meant that Seti had to reassert Egyptian power. He mustered his armies and pointed them north. Their ultimate goal was the northern end of the Egyptian-Hittite border in the key city of Kadesh. Kadesh was an object of fascination, you could say obsession, to the Egyptian pharaohs. In the chaos of the Amarna period, the Hittites had come to dominate this city, and now Seti wanted it back. On their march north, and ahead of their showdown with the Hittites at Kadesh, Seti's armies rolled to victories against local tribes and nomads. The Hittites, though, promised stiffer resistance, and the ultimate battle was much more closely contested. But in the end, Seti's forces overwhelmed the Hittites and Kadesh was restored to Egyptian control. A smugly proud Seti erected a victory stele on the spot, then promptly did a U-turn and triumphantly marched south. Upon arrival back home, he commissioned grand inscriptions in sacred temples proclaiming his military prowess. In these inscriptions, a comically outsized Seti is shown personally clubbing his enemies to death with a mace. The Hittites didn't quite get the memo. When Seti left town, they regrouped and simply took Kadesh back. It would fall to Seti's son to resume hostilities, and he sure would. The length of Seti's reign seems to have been around 11 years. He was a quite remarkable ruler. Sure, his dad, Ramesses I, is considered the founder of the 19th dynasty, but the old man only ruled for a couple years before kicking it. It was Seti who threw his considerable energy into stabilizing the empire and returning it to the greatness of Thutmose III and Amenhotep the Magnificent. Seti squashed rebellions in Nubia, knocked down the pretentious Hittites, restored economic vitality, and the proud tradition of monumental building. In short, when he died and passed the kingdom to his son and successor, he left Egypt in a much stronger position than he found it. The 19th dynasty was off to a good start after the challenges of the Amarna period and the end of the 18th. This brings us, at long last, firmly to our main subject, Ramesses II, or Ramses the Great, which seems like the absolute worst time to hit pause on the story. But way back in the intro, I promised that I wouldn't make these episodes too long, and I promise we will have enough to say about Ramses that makes this breaking into 2 parts a reasonable choice. So don't fret, because it's going to be a lot of fun. A lot of people think of Ramses II as great, but probably no one in history thought higher of Ramses than Ramses himself. Join us for the next episode, and you can decide for yourself if this was warranted. Thank you again for listening. I'm grateful that you did.